بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يقول سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أن أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يتفكرون. In a beautiful passage in Surah Al-Rum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about marriage. And the passage where marriage is mentioned is actually a passage where he's talking about the miraculous signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And from the miraculous signs, he mentions the night and the day. He mentions human beings and how we've been created in different colors and spread across this earth. And throughout the Quran, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about those natural signs in the creation that we're all accustomed to seeing and we are in awe of. The sun, the moon, the stars, the heavens, the earth, plant life, water. All these things are creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they all indicate towards a creator. They all indicate the need of a creator. And also from amongst these various miraculous signs Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, right in the middle is this ayah that I just recited to you. That's very oft recited ayah, especially at wedding events and at maybe even a nikah invitation, you might get that ayah there itself, right? Surah Rum, ayah number 21 or 22. And the ayah goes, and from his miraculous signs is that he created spouses for you from amongst yourselves. And it's really interesting because when you and I think of miraculous signs of God, when we think of miraculous signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, things that point towards him as a creator, we think about the sun, the moon, the stars, those things around us. But how often have we said relationships such as that of a husband and wife are from the miraculous signs of God? Yet this is the shift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to have in our thinking, that he puts the sun, the moon, he puts all the creation around us. And he says this relationship of marriage in and of itself is that which is a miraculous sign, indicating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we look at marriage, we should understand that this is a beautiful union that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling a miraculous sign of Allah. Why is that? Think about it. It's two individuals that have grown up in different households, different kind of environments, atmospheres, maybe in different countries, different cultural backgrounds, right? It could be that they come from two very different worlds, yet they come together on the foundation of iman, on the foundation of love and care, on the foundation of building a family together and growing together. And not just being together in this life, but always the goal is of any couple getting married is that there's happiness in this life and the next life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the purpose why, one of the reasons why that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this foundation, this relationship, was لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. And this lam over here is the ta'leel, it's to explain one of the reasons, one of the wisdoms behind creating the relationship. So he says لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, it gives you two ideas. And there's some other ideas that can be implied as well, but two ideas that are there are one for being able to reside together, and the other one being able to find comfort, find tranquility with one another. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this relationship was created, this miraculous relationship, this beautiful relationship was made for what purpose? So that we could seek sakina, so that we could seek calm, tranquility, and happiness and joy with one another, as well as being able to reside with one another, live with one another, be a source of comfort and ease for one another. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says about the relationship, afterwards he says, he says, وَجَعْلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. And he made love مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. And mawadda is a type of love that requires effort, requires work. And if anybody who's been married or about to get married or has been married for a while, you know the relationship takes work. It's not something that just runs by itself and it'll just figure itself out. You have to put work and effort into it. There might be times when there's clashes in communication, there's clashes in all kinds of regards, there's ups and downs in the relationship, but when you put work and put effort into that relationship, it grows. Just like you can think of any kind of vegetation or a flower or some kind of something you're growing, right? If you think about when you tend to something and take care of it, make sure it gets the proper nourishment, the proper water, the proper light, then then the plant has the ability to grow. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about that Allah is the one who placed in between the husband and wife an intense love that must be worked on, as well as rahmah. Now, in the verse itself, we're taught that the relationship is a miraculous sign. But at the same time, we're also taught that work and effort is required for this relationship to be workable, to be sustainable, right? And not just love has to be worked upon, but also mercy. And when you think of love, that might be the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of marriage, right? For those who are maybe are not married yet, or those who just think of the idea of marriage in general, right? Married folk, non-married folk, the idea of love comes to your mind because marriage, we assume, is built on love. But yet, that's not just limited to love, because in the beginning, it could be, in one of the wisdoms of the order, some people say, is that think about how in the beginning of the relationship, there's that intense period of love, the newlywed phase, the honeymoon phase, right? Everything is perfect. Your spouse can't do anything wrong. Everything about them is perfect. And then you start to humanize them a little bit more and more. And then you realize, okay, wait a minute, they're human just like me. And they have certain habits that I'm not fond of. And I have certain habits that they're not fond of. So what's required in the relationship, beyond just that love and that intense desire to be with one another, care for one another, spend quality time with one another, beyond that is also mercy. Because that mercy is what allows us to be able to recognize when we have hurt our spouses. When we have hurt our spouses either emotionally, right? We have said something to them, or in their presence, or publicly, and we have said something that's caused them hurt. And that's what allows us that mercy, to be able to recognize our faults, our shortcomings, and go to our spouses, swallow our egos as husbands and wives, and go to the other and say, you know what, I shouldn't have said that. I'm very sorry. I take that back. I will try my best not to do that again, to go and be very sincere in that manner. And that mercy is the same thing which allows this relationship to continue, in the sense that the spouse that's been hurt, the spouse that feels disrespected, the spouse that feels unheard, they're able to say, you know what, I forgive you. I accept your apology, and we can move forward, and we can talk about how we will try to prevent this from happening again. Now imagine if both of those pieces are not there. I'll tell you this, that many people that come to us for consultations, right, and many times we kind of re-navigate them towards other counselors in the community, because we work with a very specific kind of group of individuals. But many times when they come to us and their communication hasn't been on point, right? They've just been arguing, bickering, the respect level is going down between the husband and the wife, and they're not able to communicate their ideas properly. They're just getting angry at one another, and they're not able to show that love and mercy at that time. If you allow that to keep on going in the relationship, and whatever challenge you're going through as a couple, that will start to become worse and worse. Just like if you think about any kind of a wound or an infection, if you don't treat the infection gets worse and worse and wreaks havoc on the body. So the same way, if we assume that, you know what, this is just in regards to, this issue is this just in regards to in-laws, or this issue is just in regard to finances, or this issue is just in regards to intimacy or our conversations, and you're just saying that it's just in regards to that. But realize that as a husband and wife, as a family, there's no such thing as you can compartmentalize one issue and say, oh, this is going to stay over here and it's not going to affect the rest of our relationship. No, the reality is, when you're upset at your spouse for something, that will seep into every other aspect of your life. If your emotional intimacy is lacking, most likely physical intimacy is lacking. If your conversation is lacking, your communication rather is lacking, most likely your conflict resolution is going to take a massive hit. Your ability to say kind things, say kind words, to have pleasant exchanges throughout the day, throughout the week, are going to be significantly impaired, because there are various parts of the relationship that are lagging. So we see that this formula that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us is that for us to attain this tranquility, for us to attain this comfort and love and peace with one another, you have to look towards these two characteristics that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions. Number one, that was of love and care, putting that effort in. And maybe another time we can talk about the languages of love and talking about how to develop those and the various languages that people speak. And that's a very well-known even book and concepts that are out there, that languages of love. So I would definitely recommend looking into that. But our focus is not quite that today. And the second aspect is Rahmah, mercy, being able to forgive, admit our faults, and being able to move on and improve from there, improve from where that challenge or difficulty was in the relationship. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala concludes the ayah by saying, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. That without a doubt, this, along with the previous verses or previous miraculous signs that were mentioned, they are all miraculous signs for those individuals, those people that use their intellect and reflect. And this relationship of marriage can be seen as that. Now, I want to make a shift from, we talked a little bit about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this relationship. Now I want to go into a little bit of practicality and look into the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're probably very accustomed to hearing about the marital life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and talking about, the great love and care and compassion that was there. And many times people really haven't even heard that. But what our focus today is going to be a little bit different in regards to some of the challenges and difficulties that the Prophet ﷺ faced in his relationship. What were some challenges and difficulties he's faced? And for some individuals, I remember I've given a khutbah before similar to this, or I've given a talk before this, and people will come up to me afterwards disgruntled, very upset. I can't believe you said that about the Prophet ﷺ. And I say to them, don't worry, I didn't say it. It was Umar radiallahu anhu. It was his wives. It was literally the tafsir in the Quran. It's not something I made up about the Prophet of Allah. This is the reality, which is known about his relationships. And that the reality is that the Prophet ﷺ had good times as well as challenging times in his relationships, just like every single human being. And that's the beauty of the relationships of the Prophet of Allah, that when you and I look towards the worship of the Prophet of Allah, we say, wow, there's no way we could ever be worshippers like him because he's the closest to Allah. But yet, when we look at the human aspect of that relationship, of being a husband, being a father, being, having older individuals that are your caretakers, right? We can relate to the Prophet of Allah in various ways because natural human emotions are there. That aspect is there. This is something that we can look at the Prophet of Allah's role model, that what did he do correctly? And also what were some challenges and difficulties in his relationship? And even to the extent that I'll mention that some scholars say that a divorce either took place or was about to take place in the marital life of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He actually went ahead and he pronounced the words of divorce to Hafsa radiallahu anha, who is the daughter of Umar radiallahu anhu. In the Sahih narration, we have that in Sahih Muslim that Jibril alayhi salam in the narration comes down and tells the Prophet of Allah, "Raji'aha innaha sawwamatun qawwama." Take her back. And who's this from? Who's this information coming from? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah is telling him, take her back because she is someone who is dedicated to standing in the night and praying, as well as she's dedicated to fasting. Now think about this. Do you think the Prophet of Allah divorced or said the words of divorce to Hafsa radiallahu anha because she wasn't a good Muslim? Because she wasn't praying enough or reading enough Quran? That couldn't be the case, because the mothers of the believers, the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are some of the strongest believers, greatest worshippers of Allah, the most dedicated. And Jibreel alayhi salam himself is coming down and saying that Allah is testifying. And if Allah is saying this person is dedicated to praying at nighttime, right? Qiyamul Layl, this person is dedicated to fasting all the time, then that's a huge thing. That's just not you or I or a human being saying that person fasts a lot or prays a lot in the nighttime. Rather, it's Allah making that statement on that behalf. And the Prophet of Allah learns from this. And there's actually another hadith that we also see, and Allah knows best. It could be that this hadith was something that he learned from this experience. But that hadith is that never hate one of your spouses. Why is that? The reasoning behind it is he says that never hate one of your spouses because there might be certain qualities or characteristics that you dislike in your spouse. But look towards those other characteristics and those other qualities that you do admire about them. And that's the reality. When we are getting married in that engagement period, we should learn about our potential spouse. Islamically, that is perfectly okay. And we have an entire premarital training for singles on what to do, what those rules and regulations are, and how to go about that entire process with the prospective spouse, as well as the prospective in-laws and all those things. So it can be tough to manage, but to go out and understand who this individual is, as well as talking to their friends and family members and their siblings to really get a good idea of who this individual is. You can learn a lot about that person. And once you've done that, you can hopefully see certain good qualities and also keep in the back of your mind other qualities that might be things that you guys might butt heads in, right, in the relationship. And as the relationship goes on, you've been married for a while now, you'll be able to see, okay, there are certain places where our strengths lie, and there are other places where our growth areas, right, they need to be improved, they need to be worked on. So that is quite important to be able to understand that there will be strengths and weaknesses. And the Prophet of Allah is indicating to us that yes, there's no such person with a perfect spouse, right? There's no one that's going to have the perfect spouse. Everyone will have their shortcomings here and there, but they also have good qualities. Don't look at only those negative qualities in your spouse and say, my spouse is defined by X, Y, and Z. Rather say, okay, these are things that can possibly be improved on, and these are things that I love about my spouse, right? And now to look a little bit more into some of the challenges the Prophet of Allah faced. How do we know that he faced challenges and had marital difficulties? Obviously, if Jibril alayhi salam is coming down and saying to take back his wife, there must be some kind of dispute, some kind of argument, some kind of discussions. I want to narrate to you, inshallah, in the best of my ability. I have a little bit of time left before Safiya comes. But this incident that gives us a lot about the marital lives, about the companions, as well as the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I'm going to have to kind of shorten the narration and get to exactly what we need. It's actually a very beautiful narration, and it is found in, let me just make sure I quote the source correctly. In Sahih al-Bukhari, and you'll also find it in the tafsir of Surah al-Tahrim, and you'll also find narrations in Sahih Muslim that it's also reference to this or similar or circumstances that had happened or similar narrations. So what happens is, so basically we know that Sahih Bukhari and Muslim are the most authentic hadith sources that we have, right? So the Prophet of Allah had some marital issues and some kind of challenges in his relationship, to the extent that this narration, by the way, we get from Umar radiallahu anhu. So he says that one night I was in my home and it was late at night, and all of a sudden my neighbor comes and starts banging on the door, and he gets worried. He says, what's going on? And he says that the Prophet of Allah has divorced all of his wives. And this was not the case. This was not the case, but the rumors were spreading so quickly that the entire community had thought that the Prophet of Allah had divorced his wife. So Umar radiallahu anhu then goes to the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he finds Muslims all in the masjid, and some of them are crying, some of them are shocked, they have no idea what to do, they're kind of really worried. And the Prophet of Allah is in a private area in the actual masjid, which was kind of reserved only for him. So the Umar radiallahu anhu goes and seeks permission to go and speak to the Messenger of Allah. He does this, and the first time, no response. Second time, he says the Prophet, the servant who's there says the Prophet of Allah didn't say anything. The third time, he finally says, he'll see you now. Now remember, who was Umar radiallahu anhu? He is Umar, the father of Hafsa, one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. So who is going to speak to the Prophet of Allah? Umar radiallahu anhu, who is, yes, he is the friend of the Prophet of Allah. He's the companion. He's the student. He is one of these future successors of the Prophet of Allah. But at the same time, he's also a father-in-law. So there's a very interesting kind of dynamic and relationship going on over here. Now, realize that when you're going through marital difficulties, and if everybody knows what's going on, sometimes, or if you're going through any kind of challenge or difficulty and everybody knows what's going on, when people say, I need to talk to you, what are they most likely coming to talk to you about? The Prophet of Allah knew this. And it could be because of the human nature. The first two times he said, he just didn't say anything. He was thinking, pondering. And then finally, the third time around, when permission was sought, he said, okay, fine, let me go and speak to Umar. Let Umar come in and speak to me, right? Now, that in and of itself is a huge lesson for us, that someone is coming to ask us about a relationship. Someone is coming to kind of analyze or talk to us about a relationship. Many of us from our cultures, from our cultural backgrounds, and that could be from the subcontinent, from the Arab world, Africa, it could be from, parts of Asia. We were raised over here and we kind of assimilated, and our culture is just the dominant culture over here. Regardless what our cultural background is, we don't want our business getting out. We don't want people talking about our marital difficulties and our challenges, right? And I'll use a famous Urdu proverb. I won't say it's a proverb because it's something that is destructive rather, right? The famous Urdu saying, "Log kya kenge." If you ever heard this before, just know that whatever was being talked about, that statement is going to crush your entire argument. Log kya kenge, which translates to, What will people say? What will people say? Well, let me tell you what was going on. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, everybody and their moms and their dads and their kids were thinking that the Prophet of Allah had divorced all of his wives. The entire town was talking. The Prophet of Allah did not care. He is the one who receives revelation. He's a leader. A leader does not want to be, they don't want their names to be dragged through the dirt and the mud. Yet the Prophet of Allah could care less about what people had to say. And that's something so profound that we should learn from. Any other leader in capacity of power, a teacher, right? A teacher doesn't want to be belittled or humiliated by their students. A political leader doesn't want to be, dragged to the ground by their followers or the people that they're representing, right? They don't want that. But the Prophet of Allah knew that the entire community had gathered and people were talking and saying whatever they were. But yet he knew there was a challenge. And he was there in isolation praying. He was making dua, he was praying. And not only that, when his father-in-law came to speak to him about this, when Umar radiallahu anhu came to speak to him about it, he didn't shut him away. He allowed him to come speak. And now what ensues now shows us an insight. It's very, very deep. There's so many profound lessons. I'm going to see how much time I have to be able to get through it. But the lessons, the very first thing, Umar radiallahu anhu comes and he asks the Prophet of Allah, very blunt, very direct, which we know Umar radiallahu anhu is known for that. He says to him, Ya Rasulullah, did you divorce all of your wives? And he responds back and he says, I have not. And one narration is that, Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillah, and he tells the Muslims that, okay, Muslims know that he did not divorce all of his wives, and they basically can rest at ease. And now Umar radiallahu anhu comes back and he starts speaking to the Prophet of Allah. And the narration's very lengthy, so I'll just go to exactly what we need from there. One portion of the narration, it talks about where Umar radiallahu anhu says, knowing the Prophet of Allah is here because of marital discord, he says, Ya Rasulullah, the other day I was speaking to my wife, and in one narration it says that he was actually thinking over a matter and he's like, what should I do? What should I do? And his wife comes in and says, well, why don't you go do this? And then he looks at his wife and says, why are you telling me what to do in my matter and my situation and what I should do, right? Like, kind of keep to yourself. I'm Umar, I'll figure my own things out. And his wife is astonished, looking at him and saying, well, the wives of the Prophet of Allah can speak and they can have opposing ideas and oppose his ideas. And there might be times that when they butt heads, the Prophet of Allah and his wives, and they don't see eye to eye, and the wives of the Prophet of Allah stop speaking to him, and they might not speak to him for half a day until the nighttime. And Umar radiallahu anhu was completely shocked and baffled and saying, how is that possible? How would the wives of the Prophet of Allah ever dare do that? So who does he go to? His daughter, Hafsa radiallahu anha. He goes to her and asks her, is this the case? That you and the wives of the Prophet of Allah disagree with the Messenger of Allah sometimes, and you sometimes don't speak to him for half a day or even more than that, right, for until the nighttime? And Hafsa radiallahu anha responds back, probably very timid and very afraid. She says, yes, that is the case. And Umar radiallahu anhu has the same reaction which many of us would have, which is, how could anybody disagree with the Messenger of Allah? How is that possible? How could anybody do that? And Umar says to his daughter, don't you dare ever disagree with the Prophet ﷺ ever again. If you ever have a disagreement with him, come to me, come talk to me. Don't disagree with him, right? Don't you dare ever do that. Now, the interesting thing is that the Prophet of Allah ﷺ, he never ever says, nor are there any ayat that come down, coming and rebuking the wives of the Prophet of Allah, saying, how dare you, wives of the Prophet, disagree with the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, or the Prophet of Allah having a hadith saying, my wife disagree with me and then I divorce them, or how dare they disagree with me, this is something that's punishable. None of this ever happened. It goes to show you that what the wives were disagreeing about were not the foundations of Islam. They were not disagreeing about, for example, a'udhu billah, like revelation comes and we're supposed to pray 5 times a day, and the wives say, no, 5 is too much, let's do 3. Or no, 5 is too little, let's do 10. They weren't coming and saying 2.5% for zakah. Nah, that doesn't sound right. Hajj once a year, no, let's make it twice a year, right? They weren't doing that. What they were having disagreements about, what the Prophet of Allah and his spouses were having disagreements and butting heads about, were those natural things of husbands and wives where they disagree. Maybe the husband said something or the wife said something that the husband didn't like or the wife didn't like, or you said something in front of the father-in-law, in front of the mother-in-law that was displeasing to somebody else, or in front of guests or company, or you invited somebody over and you didn't tell your spouse. These were the natural kind of discords that happened and kind of conflicts that arose naturally. Now, one very important thing to know about our religion and to know about the Prophet, and not just our Prophet, but all prophets, is when they see something incorrect happening, something wrong happening, they have to speak up. And yet, when we don't find any narration of the Prophet of Allah saying the wives of the Prophet are doing this, a'udhu billah, and they shouldn't be doing this, and they shouldn't be speaking against me, it goes to show that those are natural things that were allowed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and by the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he actually says, by the way, that when we were in Mecca, whenever we were in Mecca, the women in Mecca, the Qurayshi women, they were much more used to male dominance and the fact that whatever the men said, that was the bottom line, end of question, end of story, right? No questions asked. That's what's going to happen. But he says, ever since we moved to Medina, he says, I feel like the women of Medina have affected the women of Mecca, our wives, right? And these women are now starting to become like the Ansari women, who are much more opinionated and open and able to share their thoughts, and their husbands will have this back and forth. And the Prophet of Allah, interestingly enough, again, he doesn't say, yes, what the women of Mecca were doing was the correct action, and the women of Medina, what they're doing is haram and it's incorrect. Rather, he leaves it open. And it goes to show us that by husbands and wives, we will have natural back and forths where we will disagree, we will have disagreements. And the most important thing that I really want to take from this beautiful story of the human nature of Umar radiallahu anhu, his wife, his daughter, the Prophet ﷺ, and the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, is that realize that regardless how close we are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how good our ibadah is, how much we fast, how much charity we give, how close and connected we are to the community and the masjid, regardless of our status in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that does not save us from having challenges and difficulties in our relationships, particularly that of husband and wife, but also that with our parents, with our children, with our siblings, with our friends, our loved ones. Relationships are by nature have the most sweetest moments and some of the most bitter, sour moments. That's just the reality of relationships. You have some of the most happiest moments in your life, as well as some of the most difficult and painful moments in your life from these very same relationships. Now realizing that when the Prophet of Allah and the companions, when they had challenges, what did they do? This instance that I narrated to you, we see that the Prophet of Allah was struggling. He isolated, he connected to his Lord. He went to the masjid, he prayed, he dedicated himself. And when his father-in-law came, his friend, his advisor, his successor, his student, when he came, at first he was a bit hesitant, but yet he said, okay, fine, let me talk and let's discuss. Let him come in, right? And there were other times when explicitly Aisha radiallahu anha and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam were not agreeing on a matter. So what happened was that the Prophet ﷺ said, okay, let's go ahead and get a mediator then. Think about this. The Prophet of Allah ﷺ is saying he should get a mediator. Out of all people in the world that you would say don't need a mediator, that don't need a counselor, that don't need an arbitrator, it would be the Prophet of Allah. He's the one who receives revelation. But yet, even though he's the only one of us that receives revelation, he's the only one of us that has a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to that extent, he still says, fine, let's get a mediator, because I want to make sure that that what I say and what you say is fair, and then we can come to a decision. There's no more better embodiment of fairness and justice than the Prophet of Allah, right? And think about it, whichever companion you'd get, who would side on the opposition of the Prophet of Allah? Nobody. It's almost impossible. So Aisha radiallahu anha, companions mention, and Aisha says, no, he loves you too much. I don't want you to call him. I want you to call Abu Bakr, my father, right? And so he himself, the Prophet of Allah, invites and has Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu come and be the moderator, be the one in the middle. And what ends up happening actually is Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu gets upset at Aisha radiallahu anha, to the extent that Aisha comes and hides behind the Prophet ﷺ, hiding from her father. And he's the one then having to calm down Abu Bakr and tell Abu Bakr, okay, just go outside for a bit. Let me just calm things down. And they start laughing, and then things kind of get resolved and tensions kind of boil over. But just to show you that the Prophet of Allah, he does something which is very counterintuitive to many of our cultures. In many of our cultures, if we're struggling in our relationships with our husband or wife, with our parent, with our child, our sibling, we say that's the relationship. That's just who it is. That's who they are. They're not going to change. We're just not going to do anything about it. And plus, If anybody came up to us and said, you know what, I see you're having some kind of difficulty or challenge in your relationship with your spouse, with your child, with your loved one, you should maybe go to a counselor. You would say, how dare you? How dare you butt into my relationship, into something that's so personal and dear to me, and tell me I should go see a counselor? How dare you? What kind of disrespectful thing that would you say to me, right? But if someone saw you limping, for example, or someone saw you coughing, especially now, right? Someone saw you coughing or sneezing or something like that, they might say, you should go to a doctor. You should go and check yourself out. Nobody would be offended if you told them to get medical advice, or your car started malfunctioning. You say, go to this mechanic, go to this person that can help you with this particular thing. Now realize the Prophet of Allah, he went and sought counsel first and foremost and sought guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And many times religious communities or individuals that are very much practicing and trying to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they might seek this route, this avenue, which is to make dua, to increase in their prayer, to maybe give more sadaqah, to fast more, right? They may do these things when there are challenges in their life. That is a great place to start. But also do not neglect the practicality of our religion and the practical advice that we are given in Surah An-Nisa. That's the advice, that if you fear a rift between the spouses, then bring a mediator from both sides, right? This could be from their families or from someone who's neutral right down the middle. It could be a community leader, a mentor. Ideally, it should be a marriage counselor, someone who specializes in that, right? So what happens is that you see through divine revelation, we're told to seek out that mediation, to seek out a moderator, someone who can assist. We're also shown from the example of the Prophet of Allah to accept help when help is being offered, as well as to seek out help. So the Prophet of Allah sought out help from his father-in-law, from his best friend, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He also accepted help when it was being offered, or a discussion or an opening of the discussion when it came from his friend, his father-in-law, Umar radiallahu anhu. He also sought out advice from his son-in-law, Ali radiallahu anhu, when there was a challenge and he didn't know what to do in his relationship. And he said, I don't know what to do in this case. What do you think I should do? He sought out help from Ali radiallahu anhu, as well as Usama bin Zayd, these are both young men in the eyes of the Prophet of Allah. They are decades younger than him. But yet he went to people who he believed were wise. They were wise beyond their years. They had expertise in handling certain situations and certain people. So being able to understand that, looking at the prophetic example, that he is able to be so humble, that he is the Prophet of Allah, could say, I'm just going to make my own decision, right? But yet he still goes to other human beings. He goes to other individuals that he believes can give him a good response, or give him some good advice, or give him some good direction. And that is the role of a spiritual advisor. May that be of an imam. And also, depending on the circumstance and the issue, and maybe in the Q&A we can discuss this a bit more, but an imam could be used for some spiritual advice, but also for the relationship aspect, going to a counselor, being able to figure those things out and work through those things, and being able to break that cultural stigma that many of us have, that when we're going through marital discord, marital issues, let's just put our head in the sand and pretend like it's not happening. That was not the purpose of our relationships. When I started the talk, I mentioned that the purpose of this relationship, this husband and wife relationship, was so that you could find tranquility, peace, love, mercy, happiness with one another. And if our relationships start deviating from that, which by the way, they'll go in ups and downs and roller coasters like that. When they start deviating from that, then we have to be able to say, let's get back to that. How do we get back to that? If us as a loving husband and wife, as a family unit, we cannot lovingly, respectfully get back to that and try to resolve our issues, then the solution that our religion gives us is to find that mediator, find that moderator, find that individual that can come in the middle and be able to assist us and be able to remove those blocks in our communication and to come to a resolution, inshallah. So with that, I think I've taken a little bit more time than I should have. I'll have Safiya come in over here and continue, inshallah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulihi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Mahad set a great foundation for maybe a more difficult topic that we're going to speak about in this next section, which is the duties and responsibilities of the husband and the wife as outlined by the Quran and Sunnah. And what's interesting about the duties and responsibilities is if we get to the bare bones of it, the fiqh of it, it's not that much. Maybe there are many duties and responsibilities put on upon us by cultural expectations and different traditional backgrounds. But when we get to the actual bare bones of it, it is not too many. And so I'm going to outline it within 8 points, right? So there's 3 duties of the husband, 2 of the wife, and then there are the mutual rights of the couples, that is 3. And so we'll start with the duties of the husband, as outlined in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 233. The provision, infaq, anfaqu, is upon the husband of the family, right? His responsibility, it is an obligation for him to provide for his family. And so what that means is the husband's money is to be used for his wife, for himself, and for his family. If the wife so chooses to work, this is her choice. And if she so chooses to use from her money that she works, the money that she gains from her work, if she chooses to voluntarily help with the family expenses, then that is her choice. But it is not an obligation upon her. As for the second, it is protection of the home, as outlined in Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 34. And this comes under the category of qawwama, which we'll talk about in a little bit in more detail. But the protection of the home, meaning the physical protection of the intruders who may come into the home. The safety of the home is supposed to be kept by the husband. So if an intruder were to come, who is the first line of defense? It is the husband to protect his wife and children. And then finally, of the duties of the husband is outlined in this word qawwama. الرجال قوامون على النساء. Now, this translation is الرجال, men, qawwamuna, have qawwama, we'll explain it, ala nisa, over the women. And so this is a very commonly misinterpreted ayah, often quoted as men have like this ultimate authority or this dictatorship relationship over their wives, over the women in their lives. And that's obviously not the case, not after everything you heard Mahad talking about in the back and forth and the disagreements and the conversations that the Prophet ﷺ had with his wives, right? That Umar radiallahu anhu was having with his wife, that there was this room for disagreement. And so it wasn't this ultimate authoritarian relationship where whatever I say goes. What it was a place that there was mutual respect. However, when conversations in the marriage relationship get to what we call like a stone wall, there's this decision that the wife has, this opinion that the wife has, and this opinion that the husband has. That's not outside of the bounds of the Sharia. Both opinions are within the bounds of the Sharia, and they can't come to a conclusion. That is when Allah has put sort of this divinely made hierarchy, which is that the husband has the final say in these matters. And so the third duty of the husband is to be the head of household, to make those final decisions in situations where the husband and wife are stonewalled. Now, there are a few conditions to this ultimate decision that is made, which is 1, it has to be within the bounds of the Sharia, and 2, it has to have khair, goodness in it, and not harm. It cannot be harmful to the family, to the wife. So it has to be within the bounds of the Sharia and beneficial and not harmful. If it is harmful or it's out of the bounds of the Sharia, that's when we say that that decision is vetoed. Even being the head of household, his decision is vetoed by a judge, by an imam, by someone who comes to mediate the situation. when we think, if I can give you the best analogy of this head of household concept, it is similar to an organization that has this hierarchical structure in which there is a director, and under that director is a co-director, right? And what's the reason for making this kind of setup is because a director, there has to be someone who makes that final decision. If you had two directors and there's two people and now you have to make a decision and they both cannot decide on the answer to this problem, a solution, then how are you going to find solutions if every problem ends up with my way or my way and we come up with no solution altogether? And so just like in an organization, the director has this final say. But the director doesn't just say, oh, my co-directors and everyone else has no say. Everyone's sitting at the same table. Everyone is making shura together, istishara, talking to one another and coming up with possible solutions. But what we have is this final hierarchical structure where if a decision has to be made in a case where a decision cannot be made, then the husband has that final say. These are the three duties of the husband as outlined by the fiqh. As for the wife, too, number one is it goes hand in hand with the last one, which is the honor and respect of the husband's decisions in those decisions that they were stonewalled at, right? So we accept this hierarchical structure and we say there is hikmah in this structure. To be able to get solutions to certain problems. And so it's honoring and respecting those decisions. Finally, the duties of the wife are outlined in a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ has said that everyone is a shepherd to their flock, and the husband is the shepherd to his family. That's where we get this idea, head of household. And the wife is the shepherd of the home. And so this is another thing that is often misinterpreted. It sort of sounds like the wife is the slave of the home. Maybe it's interpreted in that way. The wife is the servant of the home. That's not actually the case. Shepherd is one who has authority and control and can delegate tasks. And so very vaguely, the Sharia says, if the husband is typically outside of the home getting the provision, which is his obligation, then that which is in the home, the wife has the authority over that. So that's the home, the children, etc. Now, again, with this idea of shepherdship, for example, the shepherdship, if that's the word, does that mean that this hadith is saying the wife is bound to the home and she does not leave the home and that's the only place she stays? No. As we have seen in the seerah, the main obligation was that those things in the home are taken care of and they're not neglected, whether it's by her or as the Rabbatul Bayt, which is the word in Arabic for housewife. It actually means master of the home, Rabbatul Bayt, that she makes sure that those things are taken care of by others. And so in the time of the seerah, they didn't necessarily live in extended family homes. Some people did, but they often had family members living very close by. So a husband and wife and their children live in their home, and maybe next door is the grandparents. And so the grandparents are watching the kids while the wife is out getting the water from the well that might be an hour or two walk away, or she's in the marketplace buying the goods that are needed, or she's in the marketplace selling the goods that the family has made. And so there was this common structure set up where the things in the home were delegated by the wife. She may have delegated that to family members, the care of the children. She may have delegated that to other people, like they had the examples of the people of Quraysh would often send their children out to the desert for up to 2 years and even more. The Prophet ﷺ stayed for up to 4 years with Halima in the safety of the desert, with the Bedouins, with those people who had the more eloquent Arabic. And so is it permissible that the women can delegate that task off to someone, for example, the children, so long as it's something agreed upon by both parents, and so long as there is no neglect involved? So beyond the children, right, that is what's in the home, there's also the tasks in the home, the chores in the home. And so we see from the life of the Prophet ﷺ that this vague shepherd of the home concept was actualized in different ways in different homes. So some women did take care of all the chores in the home. The Prophet ﷺ in his home took care of some chores while his wives took care of other chores. As it was mentioned, he milked his own goats and he mended his own clothes. In other homes that were wealthy enough, they had servants taking care of the chores and things of that nature. So again, this idea that the woman is the shepherd of the home is that she has the authority over what goes on in the home, whether that means she does those things herself, or she delegates them out to her husband, or she delegates them out to a servant or a maid in the home, or she delegates those tasks out to other family members like babysitting and taking care of the children. So long as those things are not neglected, then her duty and her responsibility over the home is taken care of. So I just wanted to throw all of these different scenarios out from the seerah to show you guys that every household was different in how the home was taken care of, and the responsibility of the wife in terms of the home was carried out. And so what we know from the Sharia is that that has to be taken care of. What is not mentioned is how each and every one of those things are done. And so it is the wrong interpretation to think that Allah has divinely obligated the woman to wash dishes. You know, that may be in some people's mentality, but that's not where the obligation is. It's that those things are taken care of, and however that family decides what is in the best interest of everyone in that family to take care of that, then that is how it is taken care of. And so we often talk to couples in premarital training, we talk to them about those roles in the home. What do they think is the role of the wife versus the role of the husband? And what are some of those shared responsibilities? And it's so important to talk about those things before getting married or early on in the marriage, so that there's not this expectation, right? If there's this expectation that every single one of the chores falls on the wife and all of the child rearing falls on the wife and there's no responsibility on the other side, right? Or vice versa, then couples get quickly into many debates and difficulties about what are the roles. And some people start throwing out Islam says you must do this. Well, no, if we go back to the bare bones of the rights and responsibilities, it is that the home is taken care of, and for the husband it's that provision is there, and that there are decisions made. He is the head of household and she respects those decisions, but in all other cases where there's not a stone wall, that they discuss with one another and come to mutual conclusions. Those are 5: 3 duties of the husband and 2 duties of the wife. The mutual rights of the couple are 3, simply outlined by the Quran and Sunnah, which are: number 1, ma'ruf, which is kindness. Allah says in so many ayat in the Quran, when he's talking about the husband and the wife, that deal with one another in what is known to be good, with ma'ruf. And he says this in marriage as well as even in divorce, that in marriage, of course, you must be kind and good to one another, but specifically in divorce, also extend that kindness to one another. Number 2 is intimacy. This is one of the mutual rights of both the husband and the wife, intimacy, as mentioned in different ahadith for the husband and as mentioned in different ahadith for the wife. And finally, and perhaps extremely important because of the month we're in, October Domestic Violence Awareness Month, is this mutual right of the couple to not be harmed by one another. And so it goes to a general principle of the Prophet ﷺ, in which he says, "La darar wa la dirar," that it is impermissible for one to harm another, and it is also impermissible to be the recipient of harm. La darar, you do not harm, wa la dirar, and you are not the recipient of harm. And so when it comes to marriage, this holds true, that it is the right of a wife not to be harmed, and it is the right of a husband in this relationship not to be harmed by their spouse. And we have examples of each of those in the Sunnah: the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, the financial abuse, where the Prophet ﷺ is outright outlying it. And when it comes to, for example, financial abuse, there's a hadith in which the wife of Abu Sufyan, after they come to Islam, she comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, "My husband is being stingy in the spending that he is supposed to do upon us in our shelter, in our food, in our clothing. He's being stingy in that matter. He is not giving what we need. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, "Khudh min amwalihi," like take from his wealth, meaning it is his responsibility to provide. And if he is being stingy with that to a fault, then that is your wealth, that is your family's wealth, and take what you need to be able to get the shelter, the food, the clothing that you need. So if someone is, if any spouse is putting another in a situation where they are feeling stuck financially, this is all you have, and this is all you'll have for a month, so that they don't have movement and they don't have this freedom, then that is outlawed by Islam, just as we saw in the example of Abu Sufyan and his wife. As for emotional abuse, an ayah was sent down, revelation came down when a husband was verbally abusive, emotionally abusive to his wife. And that is the beginning of Surah Al-Mujadilah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قد سمع بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها وتشتكي إلى الله. Allah has certainly heard the speech of the woman who came arguing with you and about her husband, and she complained to Allah. And so the situation is one in which a woman had come to the Prophet ﷺ complaining because her husband had said a word that was very despicable. He had said to his wife, "You are like the back of my mother." And so it was an expression used in Jahiliyyah times, which meant like, I don't want to have anything to do with you intimately. You are like my mother to me, right? So the word was, you are like the back of my mother. The concept was called dhihar. So dhahar is back, and dhihar was the concept. And when this husband spoke these words, he didn't physically harm her, but he emotionally harmed her. He verbally harmed her to an extent that she's coming crying to the Prophet ﷺ. How could he say a word like this? How could he say something like this? She's complaining. She said, "I bore his children and I took care of them, and I've done all these things for all these years, and he said that word." And so the Prophet ﷺ remained silent, and he waited for revelation, and revelation came down. And literally what the revelation says is, Allah says, "Allah has certainly heard the words of that woman who complained to you, who was arguing about what her husband had said, and she complained only to Allah." And do you know what the next ayat say? Allah gives the punishment for that man for what he had said, the kafara, the expiation that he has to make because of the words that he had said. He did not raise a hand to his wife, but because he said words that harmed her heart, harmed her emotionally, Allah sent down ayat. And that was something just absolutely mind-blowing to the Sahaba, that even what we say in our homes to our wives, even in anger, those are being listened to by a sami, that the one who hears everything can hear it. And so it was a lesson for them that even words that harmed were not allowed. And finally, what is mentioned, which is not allowed, is physical abuse. And this is mentioned in so many ahadith. The Prophet ﷺ had said that do not harm your wives, do not hit your wives. Women would come to the Prophet ﷺ complaining of it. And the Prophet ﷺ had to go to a point where he had to publicly denounce it. Do not harm your wives, do not hit your wives. Aisha radiallahu anha mentions in a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ was a person who in all of his years never raised a hand in anger against any woman or any child. And so we learn from his example that he is the best to, if you want to be the best example, then be like the Prophet ﷺ. And he says, "I am the best to my wives." And so the example that we emulate is one in which there is not that physical harm coming to anyone in the relationship, not physical, not emotional, nor financial. And all of these are explained to us through the Quran and through the Sunnah. And so I will conclude, and we'll inshallah end this off with the Q&A that you guys had already submitted. That the duties and responsibilities, they are not many. They are just a few. And when you look at the Prophet ﷺ's life, he gave us models to emulate that were beautiful and that were very diverse, right? how he dealt with different wives, how he interacted with different wives, how the Sahaba interacted with their wives. All of these examples were given to us to show us how there are just different diverse ways of um, following through with these duties and responsibilities in the marriage. So long as those few duties and responsibilities are taken care of, every marriage is going to look different. Maybe your cultural expectations may be different, maybe your traditions may be different, but make sure that those cultural expectations, those traditions are not having a higher expectation, or sorry, are not put at the status of the expectation of the Islamic expectation, right? To put something at that status and say, this is ordained by Allah, or this is how Islam would have you act in the marriage, when truthfully, the bar for what is a duty and responsibility is set at just a few small things. And so long as those things are taken care of, then as a couple, you decide how you are going to make this marriage work. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. I'm going to call Mahad back in so we can finish off with the Q&A. Our MC, are you going to help us with the Q&A over here?
Yes, inshallah. Yes, JazakAllah Khair for sharing that insightful and very informative, I guess you'd say stereotype shattering talk. Inshallah, I'll get started with some of the questions that have been previously submitted. So, and if anyone who is listening in has any question, feel free to send it in the chat and we'll try to get to that as well. But to start with one from here, someone asks, what is a prophetic way to deal with feelings of jealousy when you see your spouse interacting with the opposite gender in a way that's not even haram? And how does one overcome it?
And I think the second question also related to the first, which was about jealousy. And so we know that the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, it was inherent, and it's inherent in human beings to have jealousy for some people, right? And so to have this feeling that it's wrong to feel that way is incorrect, right? Did you ever give the example of the plate?
No, I didn't talk about that. No.
So this is a perfect example. So one day the Prophet ﷺ had a guest, and he came into his home, and he came into Aisha radiallahu anha's home. And he said, I have a guest, can we prepare some food? And Aisha radiallahu anha, she didn't have any food ready. She said, okay, let me go ahead and quickly prepare something. In the meantime, another one of his wives had food prepared, and she comes and brings this plate to Aisha radiallahu anha's home to serve this guest. And what happens is Aisha radiallahu anha, she becomes upset. Why is this other wife serving guests in my home with her food? And it gets to a point where when the plate comes in, she is so upset and jealous that she hits the plate, and it falls on the floor and it shatters all over the floor. And the Prophet ﷺ realizes at that moment, okay, maybe that wasn't the right thing to have done or to have accepted. In Aisha's home, where she wanted to be able to serve the guest, I accepted someone else's plate of food. And so he just quietly picks up the food, and it says that he smiles and looks at the guests and he says, your mother has become jealous, meaning as Aisha, as a mother of the believers, one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, that she has become jealous. And he just cleans it up, and he actually sends a plate home, a new plate home to the wife who her plate had been shattered. What we learn from this is, one, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ himself, they were human beings with human emotions. And so Islam doesn't expect us to not have those innate human emotions like jealousy, like being upset, like needing time apart, like as Mahad had mentioned in his story. And so we say that this is a natural thing, so long as it is not something that is causing mistrust or to the point where you start despising your spouse because of that jealousy that you feel. If it is getting anywhere to that point, it requires a conversation, open communication. Not in that moment where you feel jealous. That's absolutely not the time to speak. And we talk about that in our premarital training. When you're upset, that's not the time to speak. the day after that incident had occurred where your spouse was talking to perhaps someone of the opposite gender, you bring it to the table and say, hey, I'd like to speak about something, and just be open about your feelings. I felt this jealousy, and I know you, I trust you, but I felt this jealousy, and maybe this is what we could do differently so that I don't feel this way again, right? To yes, jealousy is one of the diseases of the heart, and it's something that we want to cleanse our heart of. But to a certain extent, it is something natural, especially in the marriage relationship.
And just to talk to the two extremes of this, right? Many of us, because of our work or because of the community work that we do, it ends up that we have obviously, a lot of interaction with the opposite gender. Being sure we're also mindful of that and how we interact, because what might seem friendly to you, right, and just being a good individual might seem flirtatious to your spouse. So being cognizant of that and kind of maybe knowing how to tone it down, and maybe telling your spouse that something might seem a little bit off to you in that interaction, right? And being open with them in that, in not in that moment, as Safiya said, but afterwards. At the same time, also realizing that sometimes we might come from backgrounds where we assume like any kind of interaction between men and women is something that's completely disallowed. You have 400 plus incidents of halal, decent interactions happening just in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari alone, of men and women from the opposite gender interacting. Some are married, some are single, on the battlefield, in the marketplace, in various places, in respectful ways. And sometimes there are even sinful things mentioned as well, and then the things that kind of followed afterwards, and seeking forgiveness, and those things happened. But to be able to remember that there has to be a balance always sought. And when we don't go for that balance, and we get too extreme on certain things, and we try to hammer certain things that don't need to be done, that might cause additional pain and anguish. But the most important thing is to be able to communicate that. And when you communicate that to your spouse and show them why it's hurting you or it's causing you distress, you can have a conversation about it. But if it remains in your own mind and it keeps on wandering, and you're saying to yourself, why is he speaking to her like that? Or why is she speaking to him like that? Your mind keeps wandering and wandering and wandering, right? So any kind of communication that's happening with the opposite gender, first and foremost, should be open, and it should be done on like either a public forum or like in a group chat, or if it's CC'd with emails and stuff, right, for people that you're working with. And it should be done in that way. And your spouse should know that who you're speaking with, who you're interacting with, from the same gender or from the opposite gender, right? So just having that openness and communication is absolutely essential.
All right, I'll move on to the next question. Actually, these two of these questions go together, so I'll kind of put them together. One says, is it acceptable to force your spouse to be on the level of spirituality that you're on in terms of dress, speech, action, when every person is different in terms of growth in the spiritual journey? If I make a mistake, how do I convey that I'm still learning? And another question says, can a husband make decisions on how the wife dresses, for example, going from, hijab to niqab, even if, what they're doing, just hijab and jilbab, is already sufficient?
You want to start off, or?
I'll answer the last one, and you can answer the first part.
Okay.
So when it comes to, and perhaps because I discussed this head of household, right? When couples are coming to a fork in the road and they can't make a decision, this has to do with marital disagreements that affect the marriage, that perhaps affect the kids, affect the finances. When it comes to one's own spiritual journey, we go to back to the concept that Allah mentions in the Quran, La ikraha fid din, right? There is no compulsion when it comes to religion, right? So those final decisions are family decisions, couple decisions, finance decisions. When it comes to dini decisions, if you are forcing, you're only going to find rebellion. When you push and you force, you will often find that the person may do it, but not for the right intentions. Their niyyah is to not make their husband upset, and it's not to please Allah. And so rather, we use the model of the Prophet ﷺ, which was that he did what's called tadarruj. It's the model of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is step by step, right? If zina was outlawed and alcohol was outlawed at the very beginning of Islam, Aisha radiallahu anha says, we would have never followed this ever. Rather, the Prophet ﷺ came with ayat that emphasize tawheed and iman, belief in Allah, love for his messenger, so that when you grow in closeness and spirituality to him, then it's easier to accept those things which are the sharia laws, right? And so we understand from that, if we do find that our spouse is somewhere in that spiritual journey that is not the same as us, pushing will only have negative results. Encouragement towards that love of Allah and his messenger are the steps you want to take to hopefully have them come to a place where they are fulfilling their obligations. But yeah, I would say that would answer hopefully the question about the hijab and the niqab. You don't want to have your spouse doing it for a reason that makes them despise you and not have the correct niyyah in doing that action, especially if what they were doing was already acceptable, which is wearing the hijab.
Yeah, and I think you can see that time and time again from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, that you have individuals that are struggling either to make obligations or they're doing certain things that are haram. What they would do is advise the individual. They would advise the individual, right? And that's what what it boils down to. If you can advise individuals towards something and you talk to them and speak to them, as Allah says in the Quran, call to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ud'u ila sabili rabbik, to the path of your master, bil hikmati wal maw'idatil hasana, with wisdom and with a loving reminder. Maw'idah, wa'ad is something that goes from heart to heart. It's something like you give a loving, caring kind of advice to the other individual. So if that's the case when it comes to everybody else, when you call them to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're calling them to spirituality, you're calling them something towards goodness in their life, right? Muslim or non-Muslim. That same rule applies, and it should be even more so utilized when we're talking to our families. Because if our families feel that we are forcing them to do something in their religion, and even though it's for their good, realize that's the weakest form of getting action out of someone. If you inspire them, motivate them, and push them, encourage them along the way, that is much more powerful and profound than saying, you must do this. Well, guess what? Soon as you're out of the picture, as the father, as the mother, as the husband, the wife, whoever, right? Soon as you're out of the picture, they will revert back to something else. Why would we not try to instill love and care? And on top of that, I will say this, that if there are differences of opinions on certain things, and there are certain more, you would say, stringent rules versus more lax rules when it comes to certain aspects of dress, niqab versus hijab versus the type of clothing, I would say you as an individual cannot force someone, period, in Islam. But on top of that, trying to force them to get to a higher level when they're fulfilling certain base obligations is also something that's incorrect. You can't force anyone to do anything, period, right? And if you take those ayat of qawwama and responsibility and being head of household to think that you can be a dictator, realize and learn that you don't have to realize this, you will learn very quickly, right? And this is many times young religious men fall into this very often, right? And I can, ashamedly, I can admit to myself in the beginning of our relationship, that was also the case. That it's like, oh, I know Islam, this is what it's supposed to be, do this, do that. Well, just because you know certain rulings or you know what maybe is something good, doesn't mean you can impose it on somebody else and try to force someone else to do it. You're going to make that person who might love Islam start disliking Islam or start disliking certain things and not do it in spite of you, right? Because they don't want to listen to what you're saying. So realize that you can push people away from the way you call them to good. So calling them to good in a good manner, but also trying to encourage them opposed to imposing it on them, especially young daughters, young children. When you impose these things and give a negative taste of Islam in their mouths from young age, realize that when they're older and when they have their decisions and they have their options and you've been forcing, you must do this, you must do this, you must do that, when in reality, Islam is not asking us that those are musts. Maybe some of them are recommended. Some of them are obligations. Then if certain things are obligations, focus on those first and foremost. Don't try to get your spouse or your child or your parent or whoever it may be to focus on the extras when they're not fulfilling the basics. So first and foremost, start with the basics, start easy, start slow. Don't be burdensome. Recommend, suggest, and back away. Don't recommend, suggest, and suffocate, and recommend, suggest, and suffocate, and keep on trying to attack over and over again, and trying to get them to come to your side or go to the opinion you want. That's also part of ifta and giving fatwa, that the mufti, the individual that's giving fatwa, is not allowed to give the most strenuous, most challenging, most conservative opinion. That person has to look at the circumstance of the individual, and they themselves might take the most strict opinion. And that's also a misconception, that the more fiqh you learn, the more you learn about Islam, you assume that the stricter opinion is always the most correct one, right? Or the most widely followed. But the reality is that when someone comes to you, you try to give them what opinion what makes the most sense and is suitable for that person. So for a new Muslim, you might give them certain opinions. For someone who's just coming to Islam, you might give them certain ideas, certain opinions. And as they grow, they might develop into other things. But the beauty of this religion is that there is flexibility in certain areas, many areas. There's a lot of flexibility. Obviously, when it comes to our core foundations of having to pray, worshiping Allah alone, those don't change. But in other things, in terms of the flexibility of attire and what you can wear and what you cannot wear, what kind of discussions you can have with the opposite gender, how that discussion should take place, where it can take place, there's flexibility in certain things, right?
Definitely. Do you all have time for, I know time is short here, do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, inshallah.
Inshallah, okay. So this question kind of follows what we were just talking about in this previous question, where it asks, where it states that in our marriage, there are things that bother my husband or which I'm not perfect in, or I've made some mistakes. And at times my husband will make sarcastic comments or criticisms, which I don't like. So how can I tell him that I don't like these? And maybe if you could just tell me in a nicer way instead of repeating these sarcastic things.
Yeah. Can I start with like a cultural anecdotal thing? Okay, so I'll speak for at least Pakistanis. I'm from a Pakistani household, right? The idea of, even in your compliments, lacing it with like a taunt, it's like it's a common thing. It's like, oh, the biryani actually tastes good today for once, right? It's like, even when someone is something good, you have to go back and like give them a jab, right? You have to just kind of like throw a shot in there real quick, just to make sure you know that nothing has changed, right? You're still the same person. But I would say we have to really look at that long and hard, because if we're constantly taking jabs at our spouse, right? Obviously not physical jabs, talking about verbal jabs, right? If you're doing that, realize that you might feel like you're doing it in jest or you're doing it playfully, but there might be an element of truth to it. And even if there's no element of truth in what you're saying, it's still something that can cause pain and distress to your spouse. And as we mentioned before, openness and talking about it is the most essential thing. If you as a spouse see something that is displeasing to you and your spouse, what you need to be able to do is have an open conversation with them. And if you're being criticized about something, right, you also have to tell your spouse that, look, if you want me to change something, let's discuss it and talk about it. Let's not bring it up and try to jab those in there in our daily life when we're trying to be happy and live together in a good functioning manner. All of a sudden we keep throwing these shots at one another, and it just leads to arguments and discussion. And if we allow it to continue, that's what's going to happen. Arguments will happen when they're not supposed to, and there will be bitter feelings, and you feel hurt after that, and things just don't go well. Another aspect that, and Safiya can touch back on that point, but one thing I wanted to mention, that to many of the couples or individuals that come for premarital counseling training with us, we talk about when you're able to communicate and do communication exercises and drills and work together in that realm, what you're able to do is, instead of saying you are the problem, you're able to pause, think about what the issue is, what you want to get across, rephrase it, and produce it in a way where the spouse is not the problem. Rather, what you're doing is, as the spouse, you're presenting the problem and how can we solve it as a family. So for example, maybe the spouse is complaining that their spouse is always late, and they always get them late to go to places. So they come up to and say, we're always late because of you. I hate when we show up late, and you're always getting us late. You're always taking forever to get ready and all these things. That could be one way of posing it, right? And most likely what you'd hear back from them is, as soon as they say, you're always late, they might come back and say, well, your laundry's always on the ground. And you're like, wait a minute, what does you being late have to do with my laundry? Well, what that just happened was that you attacked them. Shaitan came, whispered in their ear and said, oh, he's talking about you being late. Talk about his laundry. Talk about his mom. Talk about his finances. Talk about this. Talk about that. And then it just starts going.
And then there's the round 1, round 2, round 3, and we're waiting for like a verbal KO at some point, right? A submission, a tap, something's gonna happen, something's gonna give, right? So knowing that when you make the spouse the problem, you're never gonna win. When you say this is your problem, it's very, very unlikely the person's gonna say, well, yes, I admit to my fault and let me go forward. Nobody likes to be attacked. Nobody likes to be put on the seat where you're the issue, go fix the situation, and let's come back to me when you're fixed. Nobody wants that. Being able to say as a husband and wife, let's say if we rephrased it, right, using some of the communication skills, I really don't like when we are late, and when we go to places late, it makes me feel uncomfortable when I arrive there. I didn't say you make us late. I said, I don't like when we get late. What can we do as a couple, as a family, to be able to arrive on time or get earlier? And then you sit together and brainstorm, right? You're able to say, okay, well, maybe we could put an alarm 30 minutes before we regularly start getting ready. Maybe I can watch our child, or you can watch our child, and then that'll give you more time to get ready, or I can take care of this and that'll give you more time to get ready. So instead of making the person the problem and saying, you go fix everything, you're able to say, okay, here's the issue. How can we both tackle it? This is what you're going to do to help me, and this is what I'm going to do to help me. So you both met in the middle, opposed to saying you're the issue, you're the problem, criticism, criticism, criticism. And that criticism basically means you have an issue, I want you to fix it. And then once you get it fixed, then I'll basically be able to be like, okay, now I'm happy. That's just not how life works. You have to be able to work with your spouse. May it be a child, maybe a parent, any relationship. You have to be able to work with that person, and being able to develop that relationship, that communication is essential. So you want to?
Yeah, I'll just end off with a practical tip in this realm. So if someone is often feeling that there are negative things coming from their spouse because they wish that they did something differently, I'll just give the practical example that Mahad and I have done. Is we had to really think outside of the box. And so in our case, we had decided that there was a certain issue that we were having, and whenever I heard Mahad say it, I hated hearing it. Like it made me not want to do that, or it made me just like averse, right? And so instead, I was like, if you can just send a text message, that way, one is we've already agreed to the terms that I'm okay with hearing this thing when it's in a text message, but I can't stand it when you're asking, or when it's said in a joking way, or it's said sarcastically, right? So I couldn't stand it verbally, but I said I can stand it in a text, because there's no nonverbal communication in that. There's no anger in that. It might be just a very direct text. And so that worked for us. So we had to think outside of the box, and I'd get that text. And also a text it comes at a time, and you can respond to it at a different time, as opposed to a word comes at that moment and you have to respond at that moment. And so it gave us the ability to work through certain things. When we sat down at the table, we put that issue on the table. We came up with an out of the box kind of solution, because talking it out or saying it in the past didn't work. We said, okay, we're going to text it. And when you text it, I'll take my time, and then I will go ahead and work on that at that time. And so I just want to, suggest that. Think of out of the box ways of coming up with solutions, because if everything in the past that you've been doing just hasn't been working, you got to bring it to the table when both are level headed and say, how can we both help work on this? One is, I won't say that thing out loud. I'm going to text it. The other person says, I'll accept the text and I will work on that within an hour, right? So this is literally a solution we came up with for one of our issues, and it certainly did help, alhamdulillah.
And also, when you're stuck, being able to go to a moderator or a counselor is not a failure in your relationship. Rather, that's something that shows us it's a prophetic model. It's something that we should be able to go and follow that model. It's to show that we actually care about our relationship. And that's many times it'll happen where we're not able to come to a resolution, come to some kind of agreement, and we have to have somebody else assist us in that matter. There's no problem with that. That's absolutely found in the Prophet ﷺ's his own personal life, as well as Quranic guidance for us, and to seek out that guidance when it's needed. Don't let the problem get worse and worse and worse and allow it to keep on just dragging you down. One of the most challenging things, actually, in reality, is probably getting your spouse to be able to agree to see a counselor. That's many of the times you get calls where people are like, we want to get a divorce, we want to end the relationship. And you convince them, wait a minute, do you really want to get a divorce? And they say, no, actually, we don't. We'd want to try to work on it. But then they call us back later on and say, nope, sorry, our spouse doesn't want to work on it, or they don't want to work on it. So you don't want to get to a stage where you're thinking of trying to get a mediator when the relationship is falling apart. trying to get a mediator much earlier on is easier and less heartache, opposed to saying the relationship is literally running on its last couple of spare wheels and the wheels are about to fall off the car, and now we want to fix this entire thing up. It's a lot more work. It's a lot more effort. It's a lot more emotionally draining, right? So with that, inshallah, were you able to kind of mention about premarital, all the premarital stuff?
No, so I think one of the last questions was just what are some resources? So inshallah, in the chat box, I will send it. Let's see. I'm not sure if I can send it. Let me see. Sorry, technical difficulties. It's just me who doesn't know how to.
Just doing stop share, and then you see the chat right there.
There's the chat right there. So I'm gonna put the website there. So we do premarital training. You can find that at suhbah.com/marriage prep. It's for engaged couples. We've gone through just over 200 couples. We started this 2 years ago. So we've gone through the program with just over 200 couples, engaged and newlywed. So within the first couple of years of marriage, it is a course that incorporates both the counseling end and the Islamic end of marriage. And so it's embedded into the course are discussion questions, things that you need, conversations you need to have with your spouse, either before or shortly after marriage, talking about finances, talking about in-laws, talking about communication, learning skills, how to actively communicate and how to actively listen and how to resolve conflicts. And so that is our course, suhbah.com/marriage prep.
And we've had individuals from that have taken it that are, planning on getting engaged. They weren't even sure if they were going to get engaged yet, to individuals who had been married, 20 plus years. So if you are wanting to kind of brush up some skills, improve communication, improve those various realms, you're more than welcome to come join us over there. We also have scholarships or some financial aid available for anybody who needs it. We also have suhbah.com/single. So this is more so for individuals who are trying to find potential spouses, as well as we have a class that is dedicated to singles marriage prep, which basically means trying to go through all those realms of where to find a spouse, how to find a spouse, what to talk about, what questions to ask, how to go through kind of cultural differences, parental expectations. We have a 260 question list as well. You can find on our Facebook page that we had put up recently. And those questions will help you out in terms of what to have and what are some important conversations and discussions to have with them. So you'll find that at suhbah.com/singles. We also have a conversations program for singles that we do all over the US. We have some participants from Canada as well, where they just come together and we do like an online halaqah for singles, and we do moderated discussion circles with them as well. So alhamdulillah, we're busy with that. And I'm sure you guys know of individuals who are either single, getting married, or in this process. These also make nice gifts as well. So hint, hint. Alhamdulillah.